What is history? An introduction for modern Christians, answering the question why Christians should not use modern science. The term historical is often used as a synonym for true. The historical Jesus is supposed to be the true, scientifically true Jesus. There may be a trans-historical or meta-historical Jesus, but the scientifically relevant one is the historical one. That is the most certain, the verifiable one, the one even non-believers can attest to. We can all believe that, historically speaking, a Jesus of Nazareth lived in history. Yet, this history we speak of is essentially a modern invention, a notion that the ancients knew nothing about, for they had histories in the plural, but no history singulare tantum, as a one thing in itself. No universal historical context. No historical consciousness. In pedestrian terms, our history might be regarded simply as the past. Yet, the History Channel people follow on television implies, where it does not state it up front, that history has a scientific import that distinguishes it from an ever-fading valley of forgetfulness, the past having a dreamlike character. History is a recorded past, the past saved, so to speak, on the horizon of a collective human consciousness, of a collective sense of certainty, one that presupposes a conception of man, of the anthropos, as a universal, symbolically cut off from any exclusive prerogative, any theological qualification, any reference to divine or divine-like authority. Human consciousness is that of a Machiavellian or Cartesian self or ego who sees himself defined by his or its belonging to a collectivity of egos. The human species. Human consciousness is our common secular ground, and history is the horizon, the plane of the playing out, the unraveling or evolution of that consciousness, of that sense of certainty, our sense of who and what we all are. The Jew and the pagan might be inevitably at war with each other on theological grounds, but they are at least potentially reconciled on the plane of history, where both Jew and pagan are historical beings, beings standing on an equal footing, a common ground attested to by our modern science. Now, in pre-modern times, most notably with Christianity, we have a distinction between sacred history and vulgar or pagan history. One cannot adequately understand St. Augustine without appreciating the distinction in question. Sacred history is not what we would call scientific or verifiable by our scientific method. Vulgar history, on the other hand, has the status of a mere dream. Vulgar history refers to a diluted account of human affairs, as well as to a diluted way of living. A way of living cut off or alienated from awareness of divine providence, or of the otherworldly destiny of nations. In comes Machiavelli, however, who picks up so-called vulgar history to contextualize it scientifically, reading it from the vantage point of a thoroughly secular consciousness, one that, taking advantage of a certain interpretation of Christian depictions of pagan discourse, appropriates this discourse to reconstruct the pagan past in such a way as to overcome the old divide between sacred and profane or vulgar. The consequences for Christianity are dire. Christians raised in the wake of Machiavelli's revolution are unlikely to be aware of their present condition, of the nature of the peculiarly modern context within which they exist, of their indebtedness to Machiavelli, their having fallen into the web of a Machiavellian conceit. Let us examine this conceit. On Machiavelli's account, ancient paganism needs supplementation. Yet, this supplementation is not provided by God or any sacred history, but by Machiavelli himself, rather by a Machiavellian consciousness to be shared by all of humanity. What is wrong with ancient paganism, according to Machiavelli? Where did ancient pagans fail? Ancient pagans were dreamers who did not yet appreciate the way dreams can be made advantageous for all. They hadn't discovered a way to convert all dreams into instruments to build a new world order, a universal society beyond all conflict, especially beyond the conflict between sacred and profane. Indeed, while Machiavelli begins with converting strictly pagan dreams into useful ideals, his daunting objective is to convert sacred dreams, and so all Christian references to the divine, since such references are for Machiavelli the worst dreams around, given that they are the most authoritative. They're taken seriously. But are Machiavelli's ideals not aspiring to be most authoritative? Is Machiavelli not setting out to replace Christian authority with a Machiavellian, secular, or scientific authority? What tells Machiavelli that the latter authority will not be more nefarious than Christian authority? That Machiavelli's dream of a better world will not be more obscurantist than Christianity's call to testify to Christ's second coming? is ancient paganism redeemed or vindicated by Machiavelli's idealism more perfectly than it is by Christianity's promises? Does Machiavellian discourse help us understand pagan antiquity better than medieval Christianity does? We're certainly raised to prefer a positive answer to these questions. Yet, our upbringing deserves to be questioned at its roots. What happens in the modern world is that what Christianity calls vulgar is defined on supposedly morally neutral grounds. The vulgar is seen objectively as cut off from all rationally defensible or inherently cogent moral standards. The modern reconstruction of pagan antiquity teaches moral relativism, or the view that all moral judgment is historically relative and so subjective, by which term what is meant is illusory. Modernity teaches us that ancient pagans were ultimately deluded. Deluded when it comes to the crucial question of standards or of context. Yet, since Christianity has taught us not to take pagan dreams seriously or authoritatively, we can now safely agree that non-authoritative dreams are not to be simply shunned, especially if they can be safely used to entertain ourselves in the wake of the Machiavellian effort to use ancient dreams to delineate history as plane on which all human discourse unfolds. Here we find support for the nominalist claim that pagan authority is essentially cut off from divine roots, or that there is nothing truly sacred about human imagination. History arises where the vulgar, plebeian, or common is no longer seen as tied to the sacred, and so where the sacred is seen as entirely disconnected from the secular, as the heavenly from the earthly. Thereupon, the sacred can be recycled, applied mechanistically as an ideal to settle historical matters, and so all controversies lingering between vulgar and purportedly sacred dreams and dreamers. What is sacred now is the scientific method that allows us to transcend the ancestral divide between the sacred and the profane or the vulgar. Machiavelli saves, so to speak, the pagan by debasing him, or by cutting him off entirely from the sacred. It is in order to prove the cut that Machiavelli uses the pagan dream as an ideal, a deus ex machina, serving the cause of deflating Christian authority, or the authority of Christian dreams. As children of Machiavelli's revolution, we can safely critique Christian discourse in the interests of the human species. The critique, which extends to all religions, involves the establishment of facts that may or may not be interpreted to confirm values attributed by the faithful. In other words, modern scientific or critical discourse establishes the vulgar on exclusively mechanistic grounds, allowing everyone to dream of the divine in non-authoritative terms. Hence, the rise of modern private religion, of the history of religions, or of religions of feelings that beg for the support of modern science to ascertain the objective facts, allowing the faithful to imagine the sacred. What is deemed as truly or universally authoritative now is what is scientifically ascertainable, namely, what is historical or historically verifiable. For our new authority presents itself as most liberal, leaving everyone to dream of meaning as a subjective attribution to hard facts, the res extensa or quantifiable matter of a Machiavellian extraction. Our history stands or falls on the split formalized notoriously by René Descartes between extended matter and thinking matter, or res cogitans, or between facts and values, as between the vulgar conceived strictly mechanistically and the sacred conceived as a symbolic, free-floating, mathematical-like entity, begging to be reconciled with the realm of vulgar flesh. Hence, modern Christianity's bowing before the authority of modern science, which is supposed to study our objective world. The modern Christian turns to modern science as providing a solid basis for speculation about the divine, or as confirming the credibility of Christian discourse, as if Christian authority could be established, at least in part, upon that of Machiavellian cunning. At the very least, the modern Christian seeks validation from modern science, including modern biblical criticism, insofar as this can be used to back up the claim that Christian discourse is more authoritative than any other religious discourse. Now, not evidently more authoritative than any discourse tout court, since the modern Christian finds himself bowing before the authority, the tribunal of modern science. To be sure, our Christians do not accept our new science, what Galileo called nuova scienza, unconditionally, but as a compromise, echoing the Gospel's call to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Yet, that what we have now represents a crucial deviation from the Gospels should be obvious, since the Gospels do not call us to read secular authority as a confirmation of divine authority. God does not build on earthly nature. The Jesus of the Gospels presents Caesar as a worldly authority to be exposed or illuminated by divine agency via Jesus' own followers, the true lovers of the divine. Now, such lovers being lovers of the divine hidden within the human, even as the former manifests itself most notably in human speech. Now, this is a far cry from the modern dream of a historical or evolutionary consummation of, well, res extensa, of man's conversion of mere matter into what Machiavelli called new ways and orders, modi, ordini nuovi. These liberating the spiritual potential of quantifiable matter. History as stage for the perfecting of nature through the progressive synthesis of object and subject. This is not what pre-modern Christianity is about, nor is it essentially compatible with the gospel in the Gospels. Indeed, history arises, complements of Machiavellian cunning, as formidable alternative to a classical, well, both ancient and medieval, appreciation of nature as, illuminated from within, or from the beginning, in arche, in principium, in Latin, right? And so, of nature as timeless stage for man's awakening to nature's creative spring, the interiority of nature, as it were. Classical Christianity is predicated on nature, not history. Nature as problem for us to face. Nature as cradle of divine secrets that we are called or born to return to contemplatively. Nature as mysterious book in God's mind, rather than as a book open to anyone conversant with Galileo's symbolic mathematics. Nature as universe in which the immaculate hides in poverty, as a crack in the wall, letting the light of the understanding shine through ordinary certainties. Nature as plane on which light produces mirrors of its own grace, signs of divine presence, signs that we recognize inasmuch as we partake reflectively in the light's return to itself. Our history obscures classical nature, berating it in the act of flattering us into believing that history can perfect nature autonomously of any beyond. The Christian cross is no longer upheld as place of recognition of the divine eternally hidden in nature, or of nature as optima dux, as Cicero called her. Nature as divine mind, or as the reflective act, grounding all acts as their primordial perfection. This is now replaced symbolically by history as the realization of nature through human collective sacrifice. What we have here is a new cross, and the new cross is modern science, or rather technology, a way of life, a way involving the conversion of the past into the future, the transformation of res extensa, or mere quantity, into meaningful life. Quantities with quality. Quantities used by a collective consciousness via the incessant attribution of qualities. And all this for the sake of establishing a world in which nature is completely resolved into spirit. Hegel called that Geist. And this is where nature is reinvented altogether, as attributing meaning to itself. Nature as perfectly autonomous machine, consummate incarnation of all modern dreams. Nature as a machine giving birth to itself, as if ex nihilo, out of nowhere, as if it had no past, because it will have swallowed its own past whole. It will have converted it. It will have converted all memory into the totalizing imperative of the present.